Thank you, Brenda. Great to be here. Thanks, everyone, for coming. So, do these slides work? Cool picture, but not my slides. Okay, cool. No, I want to go backwards, not forward. Okay, so I'm going to talk today about bioethics and the case against medical paternalism. First of all, why bioethics? Well, it's almost kind of implied in the word. What does ethics mean? Ethics is talking about questions of what we should do, right? So asking yourself the question, what should you do in any field, I think is the responsible thing to do, right? So otherwise you might think, oh, I'm doing it just because I can, or just because others think it's good. You might want ethics to ask yourself the question, should I do it? Or what are the reasons why I should or shouldn't do something? So bioethics is just ethics applied to bio. Who am I? I started Vitalia City. I have a great team here. Very excited to build it. I'm the general partner of Infinita VC, a fund that invested in some biotech and longevity companies. I'm a resident of Prospera in Honduras, where we're building Vitalia. I host a podcast called Stranded Technologies. I think these are my old slides, but that's okay. And so I spoke with some people on that podcast that are prominent bioethicists and scholars in the field of medical regulation. So a lot of my talk is based on some of these conversations. Also, I'm a lifelong student of philosophy and economics, right? I have degrees in it, but even more so, I kept reading and thinking about questions of philosophy and economics. So medical paternalism? A key argument today, or what I'm going to talk about today, is medical paternalism is wrong. And medical paternalism is what describes the status quo really well. It's how we're currently doing things when it comes to medical innovation, when it comes to medical technology and biotechnology. That is the status quo, medical paternalism. And medical paternalism is bad and we shouldn't do it. We should do other things. And I'm having this picture here with this dragon because if you're into longevity, you might have seen or heard about the fable of the dragon tyrant. And the dragon tyrant is supposed to be the dragon of aging and death. I think we need to slay first the dragon of medical paternalism before we can slay the dragon of aging and death. So what is paternalism, or what is the status quo? So the status quo basically means in all developed countries, also less developed countries, public officials have what's called a prohibitive approach to therapeutic and recreational drugs. Prohibitive, right? So think prohibition of alcohol, for example, as it used to be. Now we think that's wrong. But we have prohibition of cannabis, psychedelics, and of medical drugs that aren't yet approved. Right? So that means people are legally prevented from purchasing and using certain drugs without authorization, and other drugs are banned entirely. And what this scholar is arguing, Jessica Flanagan, and I've been becoming a huge admirer of Jessica Flanagan, she was in Vitalia several times, she's a professor for bioethics, is that this prohibitive approach is not justifiable if we assume other common sense moral intuitions like informed consent and anti-paternalism, right? That you make decisions over your body and that you're an adult, right? So you can't be treated like a child, right? So others don't have the right to tell you what's the right thing for you, all else equal, or at least there is a prima facie, there needs to be a strong justification for others telling you what to do. So this is kind of the primary book that my talk is based on, Pharmaceutical Freedom, Why Patients Have a Right to Self-Medicate. What is paternalism? So paternalism in philosophy is the interference of a state or an individual with another person against their will. Right? If they want anyway what you want them to do, that doesn't count. And defended or motivated by a claim that the person interfered with will be better off or protected from harm. Right? So I'm preventing you from doing what you want to do to yourself because I think I know what's better for you. That's called paternalism. So we typically accept paternalism as it comes to children. But typically we don't accept it when it comes to adults. So what does medical paternalism mean in practice, or how does it look like? If it works, I'd like to play this clip. Does it work? Oops, going forward. Does the video clip work? So this is from the movie Dallas Buyers Club, a 2013 Oscar-winning movie with, it doesn't work? Okay, then I'll just tell you what's happening there. So this is Matthew McConaughey in the movie Dallas Buyers Club. He plays a cowboy that gets diagnosed with HIV, with AIDS. And he's struggling with the medical system. And I think this movie is like perfectly illustrative of the problem when it comes to how medical authorities treat you, right? Because so Matthew McConaughey finds that there are drugs available that are prolonging or saving the lives of AIDS patients. And they're available in Mexico, in Israel, in Germany, and in Japan. However, not in the United States. In the United States, the FDA, the US Food and Drug Administration, is not approving them, even though there are patients who are waiting for these drugs. So what Matthew McConaughey is doing in this movie is he forms a Dallas Buyers Club to get these drugs delivered from Mexico. And he has like a clever legal hack how they can form like a membership club so they're not selling drugs directly to patients. And in the process, he saves loads of patients' lives. And Matthew McConaughey in this movie is justifiably seen as a hero and DA as a villain. And I argue that's actually quite close to the truth, how it looks like in the real world, right? There was actually, during the HIV epidemic, that was the case. So the first picture that I show you with protesters against the FDA is from the 1980s, when HIV patients protested, hey, you know, this is killing us. You're preventing us from getting life-saving treatments and medications. So whenever you have like these complex ethical debates, what ethicists or philosophers usually do is they simplify things. And this is a framework that I'd always like to keep you in mind with these questions, right? So we're typically, when we talk about things like regulation and, you know, committees or other human institutions, we're talking about third parties, right? So, and you're here in crypto, so you've heard about the word peer-to-peer before, right? And the idea of peer-to-peer is that you don't need anyone's permission to interact, right? So say there's a patient named Paula and she wants to take a drug, a medication. And Sally wants to sell her the drug. Similar as how you make a transaction in crypto, right? You don't have an intermediary, someone who approves of your transaction, right? There is a process how to ensure security, but it's not like an actual active intermediary. Right? And that's also the ethos of crypto, right? These intermediaries are immoral. These intermediaries have their own incentives. So we found a way in crypto to do things differently. We don't have that yet in the medical world. So in the medical world, there's a third party. So it's called the third party FDA Freddy. And FDA Freddy coerces Sally against selling drugs without his permission. Right, so I want to save your life, but Ramona is saying, no, you can't do that, you need my permission. Because, you know, I know better and you don't know what you're doing, you have to prove to me that we know what you're doing. I use the word coercion quite specifically, right? So the word coercion basically means, you know, pharmaceutical regulations are backed by threats of legal force, right? So if you don't follow the rules, then you get fined, and in some cases even criminal penalties, you can go in jail. So that's what coercion means, right? If, you know, I'm saying, Ramona, what are you doing? You know, Ramona would say like, hey, you know, I have these police officers and they arrest you if you don't like follow my orders, right? So that's what's called coercion. You know, there's alternatives to that scenario, right? So, you know, FDA Freddy could just tell Paula, hey, I have like all this data, right? And I have all this information, like this isn't good for you because of XYZ, right? So, you know, just how we're doing like rehabilitation for alcohol right now, or like nicotine patches for smokers. You know, there's information out there and, you know, you don't need to forbid it to prevent people from doing it. It seems like a common sense approach, but that's just not the status quo when it comes to medical drugs. The status quo is this. right? So this is the process, right? So Ramona is saying, well, you need to convince me that you know what you're doing, and this is how you'll do it, right? So this is called the drug discovery, development, and approval process, right? So if you want to say, I have this new thing, right? I'm like a scientist, and I found something, then you're like, okay, so give us all these studies, and then we do these 3 phases, 4 phases of clinical trials. You know, clinical trials are not a bad thing, right? So clinical trials are good, so you want data for safety and efficacy. As you can see, this process is kind of very, very excessive, right? And it takes 12 to 15 years. And I would have a video, but I think we can play it, by this guy here, Milton Friedman, who I think described quite well what's the problem with this process, right? So we can't play this video, so I'm just going to talk about it a bit. But he's basically saying this, right? So there's 2 kinds of possibilities. So imagine you're the FDA, and you know the drug is beneficial, you approve it, great, nobody complains, you're the hero. A drug is harmful and you don't allow it. Well, that's also like great. That's what should be done. You shouldn't allow harmful drugs. What if the drug is harmful and you allow it? Right? So that means, you know, there's a track record, right? You approved it, and there are victims that are identifiable, that are traceable, and might even appear on Oprah, right? So that kind of error will be thrown in your face. You might get fired right away, right? So as a bureaucrat, you want to avoid that at all costs. Versus there's another type of error. So you're not allowing this drug, but it's actually beneficial, right? That means the victims are not identifiable, right? People don't know what they're missing out on, right? So someone might die, and it appears they die from natural causes, but actually they could have been saved if the treatment has gone to the market. They don't know what they're missing, right? These victims are not identifiable, and they're scarcely even acknowledged in the abstract. This is not a risk for you if you're a bureaucrat, right? Type 1 error is the risk for you, which means you want to be overcautious, right? Maybe even not allow anything, right? So the FDA currently allows 20 new drugs to market, 20 per year. That's not a lot, right? So, and there is no law of nature that has to take that long. Before 1962, it took actually 6 months. The FDA had a mandate by Congress, it can't take longer than 6 months, right? We just have gotten used to this status quo. And the status quo is not good, right? So back to the ethics question, that's just not how things should be done, right? So lots of people die prematurely due to treatments that never existed. It's just not a headline that you can write. The victims are invisible. You can make some calculations, and these calculations are called grisly, and the grisly comparison, right? So it's kind of, right? Because there have been visible disasters in medical history. One was called, for example, called sulfanilamide and thalidomide, right? So thalidomide was a drug for pregnant women that caused babies sometimes to be born without limbs and deformed. That is very visible and visceral, and nobody wants that. You know, children and pregnant women harmed, okay, we have to regulate, do everything, right? So, you know, this can never happen. Versus the invisible graveyard, right? So just to give you one example, the delayed HIV approvals killed 70,000 people, right? And that's just a smoking gun. It's probably many more, but this is just during the 7 years that where the FDA had the beta blockers, that's what the drug was called, on their desk and didn't allow it. And standard estimates per year suggest that hundreds of thousands of people could be dying from lack of medical progress that we could be making. Right, so thalidomide was really the big change. So thalidomide was, in a way, the 9/11 for drug development. By the way, the group of people who are most affected by this negatively, or very negatively affected, are pregnant women. Why? Because nobody wants to develop a drug that's causing harm to pregnant women anymore, ever. Right, so it's just too risky. There's so much regulation, right? We need to protect women and child at all costs, which means it's just way too risky for anyone to develop new drugs. So that means pregnant women nowadays have no FDA-approved drugs that are available. There are some that are available that are off-label, meaning we don't have good or official studies on how effective they are. It's just basically from clinical practice. You tried out something that's approved for something else. You can go too far, right? None of us wants people to see people dying, but you can go too far, right? So, all right, you don't want your child to be harmed. If you want to reduce the risk to 0, you put the child in a cage, right? But that means the child's missing out on life. So there's a whole discussion about the legal process that leads to that. I don't have that much time in this talk to talk about it. I stay with the ethical part. But the short version of it is, it has to do with specific ways in which our legal system works, right? So in our legal system, for example, you can't reverse certain legal decisions, right? There's lawmakers that make new laws, but there's no law unmakers, right? These laws are like too much, right? Or we shouldn't have them, right? So that's why we always get more laws, and never do we get less laws. Another thing that I want to give you as a framework to train your ethical and moral intuition is risky refusal versus risky access, right? So imagine the following scenario. Your doctor recommends you insulin because you're diabetic, right? But you're like, the insulin didn't work on me or has these negative side effects. I want to try exercise instead, right? So the doctor, even though she might think, okay, you should take insulin, right? It's better for you. You know, the patient, we think the patient has a right to say no in that case. Whereas if it's the reverse, so the doctor recommends exercise, but you want to get insulin, you're like, I tried exercising and it's really, I don't like it, it's so boring, and can you just give me insulin? The doctor can deny it to you, right? So we give the right to the doctor to make a decision for you. It's kind of weird. It's an asymmetry. It's actually historically not always been the case. It used to be the reverse. So, is that the slide I wanted? Yeah, so another example of this is Steve Jobs. Actually, let me give this example before. So you might think, all right, so yeah, but we need some rules, right? So even at the cost to some people, right? Some people might die, like Matthew McConaughey. Everyone benefits if we have these rules, or if we have like the FDA or whatever, right? So the question is then, is that, is it okay to kill a healthy, innocent person to save the life of 5 others, right? So imagine you're volunteering someone to be an organ donor, right? There are these 5 people that might die if they don't get organs. Most of us say, no, you shouldn't do that. That's kind of very unethical, and you shouldn't be going around stealing people's organs, right? So I guess you could say, all right, what if it's 1 billion people? You kill 1 innocent person to like save humanity. Yeah, probably, right? It's not great, but it's all of humanity. There is some sort of threshold, I guess, right? There's no absolute, right? You can never kill an innocent person unless you're a very strict Kantian, which I'm not. But at least the benefits have to be very large for you to justify harming an innocent person. Also, can you kill like 1,000 people to maybe solve cancer, right? You just want to mess around a bit, just want to test things. No, right? So the benefits kind of have to be certain. You can't just, I'm dropping a bomb on this city, so maybe I can kill like the terrorist, even if thousands of people die. That's just not right. So I wanted to bring these 2 examples together in the case of Steve Jobs, right? So Steve Jobs refused life-saving cancer treatment. He said, no, I want to do like national therapies or whatever instead. That's risky refusal, right? So it was not the right decision for him. But everyone says we should be able to do it. And then the other interesting thing is there's actually a good reason to force a better choice on him, right? Because Steve Jobs was probably the most productive individual at that time in history, right? So he would have made the world a lot more better if he lived longer, right? So you might think, to make the world like a lot better, can't you just like, come on, Steve, I'm putting you on receptacle and I just save your life, and maybe you haven't. We have a presumption that you can't do that to him, right? It's his choice. Right, so that's why like the idea of informed consent is actually very powerful, and we apply this idea in all sorts of other contexts. We're just kind of blind in a way to the status quo. there's kind of 3 objections to anti-paternalism. I'm not going to go into them. Those are a bit academic, right? So I'm just saying, okay, paternalism, anti-paternalism is not absolute. There are exceptions, but these exceptions don't apply in how we're doing things right now, right? So the benefits at least have to be large and certain, but typically you don't want to treat adults like that. I'm jumping a bit ahead through some of these questions. Again, it's a bit academic, but I have a feeling that there are questions in the audience around bioethics, so we're going to want to get to a couple of those questions. What's okay, human enhancement, whatever. My conclusion is, should we follow the law or should we pursue just outcomes? Right, so people have this intuition that you should follow laws, and that's a correct intuition. You should follow laws, but sometimes laws are unjust. And the question is, what do you do, right? So we've seen Matthew McConaughey in Dallas Buyers Club. He was kind of hacking the law, right, because he saw people are dying as a result of bad laws, and we think that's a good thing. He's a hero in that case. If it hadn't worked out, we probably would have seen him as a villain. But in general, it's not smart to violate the law, right? Because most people have the correct presumption that lawbreakers are bad people and not to be trusted, right? So you shouldn't break laws. So how do you change the legal and moral norms of society, right? And that brings me to questions like, how do you make progress, right? Because a lot of real and important progress in the world is, we're missing out on. And there's always been a time where we didn't accept a certain technology, like in vitro fertilization, contraception, sleeping in a stranger's home. There's a whole Twitter account called Pessimist's Archive that is listing out all these examples of technologies where society has said, oh, this is bad, we shouldn't do that, right? And then now, for us, it's normal. My favorite example is bicycles, right? So what could people possibly have against the adoption of bicycles? And they said, oh, the women, they're going to drive to the neighboring village and have sex all over the place there. It's like that was the argument against bicycles, right? So in any point and in any time, we'll resist the adoption of new technologies for the fear of the bad they might do, ignoring the good that could come out of it. Potential solutions for this are medical tourism, legal reform, so all of these things I could be happy to talk about in more detail, right? So these are, you can adopt these in a variety of different places. As you heard before, we went to just do a new place, a new jurisdiction that's free from the FDA, where we set up a different set of legal institutions. So, we use regulations. Regulations are good, but we just do it differently. Right, so, it's in Roatan. It's a direct flight from major US airports. From Argentina, you can fly, I think, through Panama or through Miami. And then you're there, and, this is how it looks. Really beautiful place. This is the tower where we live in right now. Right, so we have special economic zone laws, a pro-crypto legal system, as well as regulatory flexibility and medical freedom. There's a community of more than 1,000 people worldwide, right? So there's probably like 20 or 30 living there at all times, and we constantly do events. So you can visit us there at any time during the year and help us build a crypto biotech city. So here's how you can connect with us. There's a whole link tree with more information, articles that I wrote, also on bioethics and how the alternative regulatory system works that we're proposing. And we're doing a couple of events for founders from Latin and Central America. And we're doing a whole crypto city builders month similar to this here, where we talk about what crypto solutions we need to build that biotech city. And in January and February, we're doing something that's not announced yet, so best join our newsletter to find out when it happens. So thank you very much for listening, and very much looking forward to your questions.
Do we have a question for Niklas?
Thank you, Nicholas. Very thought-engaging talk. If I can just very roughly summarize with a headline, anti-paternalism, the solution is informed consent. How do you deal with the informed part? Because I think the key is there, right? And if there's an information war between people with different interests, how do you inform the average person? Which tools do we give them to be able to make the right choice?
Yeah, so it's a very good question. I could answer this in great detail. how we're doing right now in practice is there's different sets of regulations, and as a provider, you can opt into different ones. And there's one out there that's my favorite. So basically, if you do a business in Prospera, you are regulated if you provide healthcare services. Why? Because there's a risk of harm without your consent or without you being informed enough, right? Someone should just go, oh, take this snake oil or whatever, right? So you're regulated if you want to provide medical services, and you need to provide, you need to get insurance, right? And if you get insurance, you need to agree to binding arbitration and to regulation, right? So this is my protocol. If I follow it, then I don't have to pay damages, right? So this way, the regulation basically gets agreed on between the provider and the insurer. And what we have right now is a regulation called the mini-circle regulation in Prospera that basically says, all right, we just have a very strong protocol around informed consent, right? So if you have a clinical trial, here is like the hoops you need to jump through to educate the person, right? The person must testify to some medical knowledge, and you need to tell them what this thing is doing and what the risks are, right? So there is like a process you need to follow, and like you need to document that the person, that you obtain consent from the person and things like that, right? In a way that a third party would be able to say, yes, this person provided consent. This is how we're doing it in practice right now.
We have another question.
I'm sure there will be more questions, but because you picked on me during the presentation, I wanted to say I'm not upset with you. And then I do have a question.
Thanks for being my FDA.
Yeah, right. So I do have another question. This is more related to learning from the past. So I remember being very influenced by a book I read by Mo Sayed, like Black Box Thinking, that compared the medical treatment industry with the aviation industry. And in the aviation industry, every incident is dissected. We try to learn from that, and we change our systems so that it can't be repeated, right? And then we make it easier for people to operate within the system. And the book argued that like we don't do this in the medical system. We just chalk it up on the patient, unforeseen event, a complication, and we don't try to learn from it. Have you seen this in your research on the medical trials and FDA? It's like, has anyone ever done a sort of a tracking post-FDA approval with the initial studies to see how effective those studies were or were not compared to shorter studies, for example? To your knowledge, sorry.
Yeah.
Maybe this is something for DeSci to cover, right? But yeah.
That is a very good question. I don't know the precise answer to it. What I can say is there's no strong incentive to do studies after approval. Right? And that is simply because, to a large degree, the pharma companies and doctors are exempt from liability if they give you the drug. Right? So there is just no incentive for them to figure out what's the truth. Is it actually harming patients or isn't it? That's actually a huge problem, and it's a problem that we don't have enough data on. So one of my favorite thinkers, Robin Hanson, once found out that getting more medical care is actually on net harmful for you. Right? So more than 50% of treatments you get, like surgery, medical drugs, whatever, more than 50% of it makes you worse. Right? And we don't know which is which, right? So we don't know which ones are the good ones or bad ones. So a lot of the times, usually you shouldn't get drugs and medical treatments or surgeries, right? But we don't have good data on which one that is, right? Because we don't do a lot of studies after.
Another question. Do you have another question for Niklas? Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for a great talk. I wonder what thoughts you have regarding this issue of paternalism in regards to the group or the society versus the individual. I'm sure we can think about a lot of examples, and the obvious one that comes to mind is the recent COVID epidemic and the vaccines.
Yeah, it's a very good question, right? So these questions, the individual versus society. So you can go very deep on this. Just to give you one example, as I mentioned, the organ donor, right? So the organ donor example, right? So can you kill one innocent person to save others? that's a society level question, right? So, and I think there's also other society level questions, right? So, for example, if we're like a democracy and we make like a majority decision, all right, so you can't do this. Does that justify preventing you from, you know, saving your own life or people to do things? No, right? So a majority is not enough, right? If we agree collectively in this room, all right, these two people should marry, well, nobody would accept that, right? And that is because you have certain rights, right? Same in other, you know, we go to this restaurant together and all of you decide, oh, Niklas, you have to pay. So, oh, what if I don't want to pay? Can then you like, you know, beat me so I pay? No, I have certain rights. So I think you can certainly answer these society level questions. And paternalism by society as a whole, I think is not okay, right? We see paternalism against minorities, against foreigners, against, you know, groups that are not popular, like drug users. So, you know, it's, I think, an important question and, you know, a very deep conversation.
Okay, please, another round of applause for Niklas. Thank you so much for our Italian friends.